It is the winter of 1941, and somewhere in the back streets of a bombed-out European city, a German locomotive engineer is making his rounds. The night shift at a railway marshalling yard is cold work, breath steaming, lantern swinging, boots crunching on gravel frosted hard by continental winter that seems determined to outlast the war itself. He is checking boilers, inspecting fireboxes, doing what engineers the world over have always done, keeping the machinery fed and running. He reaches down into a coal pile near the firebox door, picks up a shovel, and begins his work. And then he notices, half buried in the fuel, a rat. Not an unusual sight. Railway yards across occupied Europe are infested with them, but this one is different. This one is dead, stiff, and oddly heavy. He frowns, nudges it with his boot, perhaps intending to toss it aside. He may even pick it up. He may not get the chance. Because this rat is not a rat, it is a bomb. What this engineer has stumbled upon, or what perhaps he never stumbled upon at all, because the historical record is frustratingly incomplete, is one of the most outlandish weapons ever conceived by the fertile, occasionally unhinged imagination of the British Special Operations Executive. In a war already defined by innovation, desperation, and a willingness to try almost anything, the SOE's exploding rat program stands apart. It is absurd, it is ingenious, and it is, in its own peculiar way, a window into the extraordinary lengths to which Britain was willing to go in the darkest years of the Second World War. This is the story of how a dead rat became a weapon of industrial sabotage, and why the Germans were, for a time, more frightened of rodents than of anything else their enemies could drop from the sky. To understand why anyone would stuff a rat with plastic explosive, you must first understand the position Britain found itself in during 1940 and into 1941. The fall of France in June 1940 had been catastrophic. Within 6 weeks, the most powerful military force on the continent had ceased to exist as a fighting unit, and Nazi Germany had swept across Western Europe with a speed and completeness that left Allied planners reeling. Britain now stood largely alone, stripped of its continental allies, its army battered and stripped of its heavy equipment at Dunkirk, and its capacity to project offensive power onto the European mainland reduced to almost nothing. What Britain could not achieve through conventional force, it would have to achieve through other means. Winston Churchill's directive to the newly formed Special Operations Executive, signed off in the summer of 1940, was characteristically blunt. Set Europe ablaze. The SOE was charged with conducting sabotage, subversion, and irregular warfare across occupied Europe, working with resistance groups, inserting agents, and disrupting the German war machine wherever and however possible. It was, in theory, an elegant solution. In practice, it was a monumental undertaking carried out by an organization improvising almost everything from scratch. The challenge the SOE faced was this: how do you destroy a highly defended industrial target when you cannot get close enough to destroy it conventionally? Railway yards, power stations, and factory boiler rooms were the lifeblood of the German war economy. Destroy the rail network and you throttle the movement of troops, ammunition, and raw materials. Destroy the boilers that powered the factories and you shut down weapons production. But these targets were guarded, fenced, and watched. Getting a trained saboteur close enough to plant a conventional explosive charge was difficult, dangerous, and often impossible. The SOE's answer, arrived at through a combination of creative desperation and genuine genius, was to make the explosive look like something that was already there. Rats were already there. Railway yards across Europe were crawling with them. Coal piles attracted them. Boiler rooms, with their warmth and their grain spillages, were precisely the kind of environment where a rat carcass would attract absolutely no attention whatsoever. The logic, once you accept the fundamental premise, is almost elegant. A dead rat placed near a coal pile would eventually be shoveled into a firebox along with the fuel. The heat of the firebox would detonate the plastic explosive packed inside the animal. The resulting explosion, occurring inside a pressurized boiler, could cause catastrophic failure, not merely damaging the boiler but destroying it entirely, killing those nearby, putting the locomotive out of action for weeks, and causing the kind of industrial disruption that a direct bombing raid could not guarantee to achieve. The man most closely associated with the development of the exploding rat was Lieutenant Colonel John Dolphin, working within Station 9, the SOE's research and development facility housed at the Frythe, a Victorian country house near Welwyn in Hertfordshire. Station 9 was one of the most extraordinary establishments of the Second World War. A country house staffed with engineers, chemists, biologists, and inventors who spent their days devising weapons of a kind that had never existed before. They created miniature incendiary devices, explosive coal, time-delayed fuses, and, in due course, exploding rats. The technical process, whilst deeply strange, was in practice relatively straightforward. Real rat carcasses, sourced, it appears, from the sort of places where rats congregate in numbers, which is to say the whole of wartime Britain, were skinned with care. The skins were then stuffed with plastic explosive, typically the SOE's favored PE compound, which had the practical advantage of being moldable, stable until detonated, and capable of being shaped to fit the irregular interior of a rodent carcass. A small detonator and a length of time-delayed fuse, or in some configurations a pressure-sensitive trigger, was embedded within the stuffed skin. The whole thing was then sewn back together and treated to ensure it retained the visual and, crucially, the olfactory characteristics of a genuine dead rat. The finished product weighed roughly the same as a real rat of equivalent size. Estimates suggest somewhere in the range of 150 to 250 grams, depending on the size of the animal used. It looked, to any casual inspection, entirely convincing. The SOE was, by this stage of the war, producing deceptive devices of considerable sophistication. Their exploding coal, for instance, was cast from real coal samples obtained from specific German railway regions, ensuring that the color, texture, and even the internal grain patterns matched the fuel actually used in that location. The exploding rat demanded a similar attention to detail, and Station 9's team appear to have risen to the challenge. Production numbers remain classified or simply unrecorded, but what is known is that at least 101 exploding rats were prepared for operational use in the early months of 1942, with the intent to supply them to resistance groups and SOE agents operating in occupied France and beyond. They were to be placed in coal dumps near railway boiler rooms, tucked into fuel stores, or simply left in locations where they would be collected and shoveled into furnaces along with the surrounding material. And here is where the story takes its most remarkable turn, because the exploding rats, as far as the available historical record can determine, were never actually used. Not even once. The first consignment was intercepted by the Gestapo before it could be distributed. Whether through intelligence work, a betrayal within the resistance network, or simply a stroke of bad luck on the part of the courier carrying them, the rats were discovered. One might expect this to be the end of the story. Weapon found, weapon neutralized, program quietly abandoned. But the German response to the discovery of the exploding rats was, in its own way, more damaging to the German war effort than the rats themselves could ever have been. The Germans panicked. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Gestapo and the Wehrmacht's security apparatus launched an immediate and extensive investigation. Photographs of the exploding rat were circulated to railway yards, locomotive facilities, and industrial installations across occupied Europe. Boiler room workers and railway engineers were instructed to treat any dead rat they found with extreme caution and to report it immediately. Security lectures were given, protocols were drafted, and, crucially, real dead rats, the ones that accumulate naturally in any working railway environment, became objects of genuine suspicion and alarm. The disruption caused by the discovery of a weapon that had never been fired was, the SOE gleefully recognized, potentially greater than the disruption the weapon itself would have caused. The SOE's own assessment, documented in internal communications that have since been partially declassified, noted with considerable satisfaction that the discovery had caused the Germans to devote significant time, manpower, and administrative energy to countering a threat that did not, operationally speaking, yet exist. Every dead rat in every railway yard in occupied Europe was now a potential bomb. The psychological effect on German railway workers, men whose already stressful wartime employment now carried the additional burden of wondering whether the rodent by the boiler was going to kill them, is difficult to quantify but impossible to dismiss. The exploding rat must be understood in the context of a broader SOE tradition of deceptive devices that, taken together, represent one of the most creative arsenals of irregular warfare ever assembled. The German equivalents during this period were generally less sophisticated in their use of biological and organic camouflage. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, produced a range of sabotage devices, but their preferred approach tended toward concealment within mechanical or industrial components rather than the SOE's approach of exploiting the natural environment. German sabotage kits found in Allied territory during the war included devices hidden within fountain pens, cigarette cases, and food tins, all effective, all competently engineered, but none with the particular genius of using an object that would not merely blend into its environment, but be actively collected and processed by the enemy. The American Office of Strategic Services, predecessor to the CIA, was simultaneously developing its own range of sabotage materials, many of them inspired by or developed in close collaboration with the SOE. The OSS produced its own explosive coal, designated Black Joe, which closely paralleled the British design. American and British technical intelligence teams were sharing data throughout this period, and the cross-pollination of ideas between Station 9 and the OSS's own research facilities produced a body of sabotage technology that outlasted the war itself. What the Americans never produced, at least not in any documented program, was a stuffed animal device of the kind the SOE had pioneered. The exploding rat remains, in this respect, distinctly and wonderfully British. The true historical impact of the exploding rat is almost impossible to assess with precision, because its primary effect was psychological rather than material. In a strictly operational sense, the program failed. No boilers were destroyed, no locomotives were put out of service, no German engineers were killed by a rat they had shoveled into a furnace. The weapon was intercepted before it could be deployed, and the surviving production run, however many rats remained after the initial batch was seized, was either retained for training purposes or quietly withdrawn from operational use. But warfare is not only fought with steel and explosives, it is fought with information, with uncertainty, with the fear of what might happen as much as with what does happen. The exploding rat, simply by existing and being discovered, forced the Germans to expend resources and attention on countering it. Every security lecture given about the rats was a lecture that was not being given about something else. Every railway engineer who hesitated before shoveling coal was a small, fractional reduction in the efficiency of a system the Germans desperately needed to run smoothly. There is something in this that speaks to the broader genius of the SOE at its best. The recognition that the most effective weapons are sometimes the ones that never need to be fired. The threat is enough. The idea is enough. The possibility that the ordinary familiar world might conceal something lethal is in some respects more corrosive to morale and efficiency than any amount of actual sabotage. A man who trusts his environment can work. A man who suspects it cannot. Several exploding rats survive today. 2 are held at the Explosion Museum of Naval Firepower in Gosport, Hampshire, and at least one further example is held in a private collection. They sit in their display cases looking, to the uninitiated eye, entirely like what they are supposed to look like: dead rats. which was, of course, always the point. Return, then, to that winter night in 1941, to the marshalling yard, the frosted gravel, the swinging lantern, and the engineer making his rounds. Perhaps he finds the rat and tosses it aside without a second thought. Perhaps he shovels it into the firebox and nothing happens, because this particular rat was not an exploding one. Perhaps the scenario never happened at all, and the rats that were prepared for precisely this moment instead ended up in a German security archive, photographed and labeled and filed away as evidence of British ingenuity. What is certain is that somewhere in Hertfordshire, in a Victorian country house requisitioned for the purposes of winning a war by whatever means necessary, a group of scientists and engineers sat down one day and asked themselves a question that no one had thought to ask before. What does the enemy not look twice at? What is so ordinary, so expected, so utterly beneath notice that it could walk, or be shoveled, into the very heart of the machine that needed to be destroyed? They found their answer in the gutters and coal dumps of occupied Europe. They found it in the most overlooked of creatures, the most dismissed and despised of animals, the one thing in a wartime railway yard that nobody wanted to look at too closely. They took that creature, they hollowed it out, they filled it with the most effective explosive compound available to them, and they created something that defied every conventional definition of a weapon. The Germans found one. Just one. And that was enough to set their railway security apparatus searching every coal pile, every fuel dump, every boiler room in occupied Europe for rats that might not be rats. Hundreds of man-hours diverted, administrative protocols drafted and distributed, security lectures delivered, an entire category of anxiety manufactured from a single dead animal stuffed with plastic explosive. The SOE never managed to destroy a single boiler with an exploding rat, but they made the Germans afraid of them. They made the engineers who kept the German war machine running pause and hesitate and look twice at things they had never needed to look twice at before. In a war of that scale fought on that many fronts with that many competing demands on human attention and institutional energy, that hesitation had a value that is genuinely difficult to calculate. The British have always had a particular talent for this kind of warfare, for the oblique approach, for the weapon that wins by implication rather than by impact, for making the enemy waste energy fighting shadows. The exploding rat was perhaps the purest expression of that talent ever devised. It was ridiculous. It was brilliant. It was, in the end, a dead rat. And it worked anyway.